The echoes of laughter still clung to the grand hall of Harrington Manufacturing long after the company's annual banquet had ended. Glittering crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, and the scent of expensive champagne still hung in the air. Sophie Miller moved quietly through the vast space, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound as she collected empty glasses and stacked plates onto a rolling cart. She had volunteered for the late shift, as she always did. Every extra hour meant a little more money to send to her father, whose life had spiraled into alcohol after her mother died. Sophie had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. She even had a degree. But dreams didn't pay rent or buy groceries, and they certainly didn't cover the cost of keeping her father afloat. At the far end of the room, near one of the central tables, for young men still lingered long after the crowd had dispersed. Their expensive suits were slightly rumpled, their ties loosened, and a half-empty bottle of top-shelf whiskey sat between them. They laughed too loudly, spoke too freely, the kind of arrogance that came from knowing the world would bend for them. Sophie recognized one of them instantly. Liam Harrington, tall, broad-shouldered, perfectly composed even in his loosened tuxedo, was the son of Charles Harrington, the legendary whose name the company bore. Liam leaned back in his chair with practiced ease, a smirk playing on his lips as he listened to his friend's jokes. You saw how she shook those hips when Liam waved a couple of bills. One of them jeered, his voice carrying easily across the empty room. Another doubled over laughing, pulling out his phone. I got the whole thing on video. It's going to blow up on TikTok. Liam's smirk deepened into something colder. She brought it on herself, he said lazily. Greed makes people do pathetic things. Their laughter grew louder, crueler. One wiped tears from his eyes and added, Too bad Daddy wouldn't appreciate the entertainment. The old man's obsessed with mergers and board meetings. A total bore. Those fossils on the board wouldn't know fun if it hit them in the face. Then, as the laughter subsided, another leaned forward with a conspiratorial grin. You know what we should do? Tomorrow's the big birthday bash for your dad, right? 60th, all the city's elite, investors, politicians, the whole fossil army. What if you showed up with the most ridiculous, embarrassing date imaginable? Someone who'd make those pompous old men choke on their shrimp cocktails. He raised his glass. I'll put $5,000 on it. I'm in, said another, slapping $100 cigar onto the table. 5,000. Same here. 3 hands extended across the table, eyes glittering with mischief. $20,000 for a single evening of humiliation. Liam stared at their hands for a long moment. Then, slowly, a spark of boyish excitement crossed his face. 20 grand for the easiest money I'll ever make. He clinked glasses with them one by one. Deal. Sophie's stomach tightened as she stacked another plate. She had heard every word. She didn't dare look up. She just needed to finish this shift and disappear. But fate has a way of magnifying humiliation. As she reached across the table, the top plate on her stack slipped from her trembling hands. It crashed to the floor with a shattering sound that echoed across the hall, greasy scraps splattering across her uniform. For pairs of eyes turned toward her. Would you look at that? One of them crowed. The perfect disaster. Perfect loser, another snickered. Their mocking laughter roared again, louder than before, as Sophie froze in place, cheeks burning. Liam raised a hand and the room fell silent. He studied her with a calculating glint in his eyes, the same way one might examine a piece of furniture. What's your name, rag girl? He asked, his voice smooth and authoritative. Sophie, she whispered, staring at the floor. A slow, predatory smile crept across Liam's face. Tomorrow morning, he said, rising from his seat. I want you in my office. You'll be at my disposal for the entire day. Understood. Sophie nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Good, he said, clapping his hands once and turning back to his friends with a triumphant grin. Gentlemen, get your wallets ready. This is going to be the easiest 20,000 I've ever won. The four of them laughed as they sauntered toward the exit, still shoving and joking, leaving Sophie kneeling on the floor surrounded by shards of broken porcelain. She didn't cry. Not here. Not where they could see. She just kept collecting the pieces, one by one, her hand shaking, the weight of their cruelty pressing down on her chest like a stone. From across the hall, a few other cleaners glanced her way, their faces blank and unreadable. Sophie didn't blame them. In a world like this, everyone had their own shame to swallow. She swept the last of the shards into her tray and forced herself to stand. Somewhere above her, in an office lined with glass and leather, Liam Harrington was already planning tomorrow's joke. And she, poor, desperate, cornered Sophie, had just become the punchline. Morning light spilled across the glass facade of Harrington Manufacturing's headquarters in downtown Chicago, catching on the steel letters of the company's name. Sophie stood just outside the employee entrance, clutching the strap of her worn canvas bag and forcing herself to breathe. Her shift technically started at 8, but she had been there since 7, too anxious to sleep. All night, the sound of their laughter, perfect loser, had echoed in her head. Inside, the atmosphere was colder than usual. The lobby, usually buzzing with polite chatter, was subdued. As Sophie wheeled her cleaning cart across the marble floor, the elevator door slid open and a woman in a pencil skirt and heels stumbled out, her mascara streaked from tears. She clutched a small cardboard box filled with personal belongings. No one spoke to her. They stepped aside in silence as she hurried toward the revolving doors. Sophie recognized her, a junior accountant who had been laughing too loudly at last night's after-party. "Poor thing," one receptionist whispered to another. "Charles fired her first thing this morning." He was furious when he heard what happened. Sophie's heart pounded harder. If they were firing people over that night, what chance did she have? Upstairs, raised voices spilled from the hallway leading to the executive offices. Sophie froze as she passed by, the words too sharp to ignore. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The deep, thunderous voice belonged to Charles Harrington. It carried the weight of decades of authority, a man who had built an empire from nothing. "My board is laughing behind my back because my son thinks he's the ringmaster of a circus." "Calm down, Dad," Liam replied, his tone casual, infuriatingly dismissive. "It was a joke." "A joke?" Charles's fist slammed against a desk. A young woman was humiliated, a career ruined, and now there's a video circulating of it all. You think that's funny? You think that's how leaders behave? There was a pause, then Liam's voice again, smoother, colder. "People will do anything for money. It's not my fault she didn't think ahead. Maybe she'll learn a lesson." "Enough!" Charles snapped. "Today is my 60th birthday. It is my night, and you will not embarrass me again. No bets, no games, no childish stunts. Do you understand me, Liam?" A beat of silence. "Yeah, sure. You know me," Liam muttered. Charles's footsteps stormed past the door, the scent of his cologne lingering even after the elevator doors closed. Sophie exhaled slowly and pressed a hand to her chest. The image of that crying accountant burned in her mind. Maybe she should quit before they had the chance to fire her. But quitting wasn't an option. Rent was due next week. Her father's rehab payments were late again. She needed this job. "Come in," a voice said sharply from behind the frosted glass door. Sophie, startled, Liam was looking straight at her through the office window. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The room was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Liam sat behind a mahogany desk, spinning a pen between his fingers, his jaw tight. Charles's words had clearly stung, but his expression shifted to a lazy smirk the moment their eyes met. "Punctual. Good." He leaned back in his chair. "We have an important evening ahead of us." Sophie clutched the strap of her bag tighter. "Mr. Harrington, I don't want to do this." Please. It'll be humiliating. Everyone will laugh at me. Liam tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. One night of humiliation or unemployment starting today. His voice was smooth but merciless. If you walk out that door, I'll make sure security collects your badge before you reach the lobby. Her breath caught. She thought of her father, the man who had once quoted poetry over breakfast, but now barely remembered to eat without her reminding him. She thought of the past due notices on her kitchen table. She couldn't afford pride. Not today. What do I have to do? She whispered. Liam's smirk widened. Be yourself. He rose from his chair, circling the desk until he stood just inches from her. Be exactly who you are, clumsy, awkward, out of place. That's all I need. You'll do just fine. Heat crept up Sophie's neck. She bit the inside of her cheek to stop the tears from rising. Liam opened his wallet and pressed a handful of bills into her palm. Here, around 600. Buy yourself a dress and a proper hairstyle. My driver will take you and bring you back. Don't even think about running off. The door opened and a tall man in a black suit stepped in, the driver silent and watchful. Sophie realized he wasn't just transportation. He was there to make sure she followed orders. Half an hour later, she stood under the harsh lighting of an upscale boutique, surrounded by silk and satin she could never afford. The driver waited just outside, arms folded. She could choose anything she wanted, sequins, plunging necklines, bold colors, but none of it felt right. Instead, Sophie's hand settled on a deep crimson dress, simple and timeless. No glitter, no extravagance, just clean lines and quiet dignity. She paired it with modest heels and had her hair swept into a soft, elegant bun at a nearby salon. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, a different woman stared back. Not a joke, not a punchline. A quiet defiance lived in the tilt of her chin. If she was going to be paraded as a fool, she would do it on her terms. The rain had started to fall over Chicago by late afternoon, misting the windows of the small restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street not far from the river. Liam Harrington sat at a corner table, scrolling absently through his phone, but his thoughts were miles away. His father's voice from that morning still rang in his ears, heavy with disappointment and anger. Charles Harrington had built an empire from the ground up, and yet his son, his only heir, seemed determined to tear it down with arrogance and foolish stunts. Liam clenched his jaw and shoved the phone into his jacket pocket. Tonight he would win the bet and prove he didn't care what anyone thought. Not his father, not the board, not anyone. And then Sophie walked in. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. Gone was the trembling, messy janitor in the shapeless uniform. The woman stepping into the restaurant wore a deep crimson dress that hugged her frame with quiet elegance. Her hair, swept into a soft bun, framed her face delicately. She moved with poise, not swagger, with dignity, not desperation. Liam's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. "Sophie," he asked, his voice lower than he intended. "Yes," she said simply, meeting his eyes before sliding into the seat he held out for her. "You cleaned up well," he murmured, trying to summon his usual nonchalance but failing. There was something disarming about her composure, something that didn't fit into the joke he had planned. "I did what you asked," Sophie replied calmly. "I'm here, dressed for your game. But before tonight goes any further, I want to understand why you're doing this." Liam raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Why?" He gave a short laugh. "Because it's funny. Because my friends, and I needed some entertainment. Because life's too boring when everything's handed to you." She didn't blink. "Or because you're terrified of disappointing your father." The words landed like a stone. Liam's smirk faltered. "Excuse me." "You hide it well," Sophie continued softly, "behind arrogance and bets and cruelty. But you wouldn't go to this much trouble if his opinion didn't matter. You want to prove something, maybe to him, maybe to yourself." Silence stretched between them. Rain tapped against the window pane. Finally, Liam exhaled and looked away. "You think you've got me figured out, huh?" "No," she said, her voice gentler now. "But I think I understand more than you realize." Sophie folded her hands on the table and took a steadying breath. "I grew up in a university town. My parents were professors, literature and art history. We never had much money, but we had books, music, and each other. Then my mother got sick. We lost her. And my father, he never recovered. He drinks now. Most days, he doesn't even leave the house. So I left school. I work wherever I can. And every month I send him money so he can eat and pay rent. I clean floors because it's the only way to keep him from disappearing entirely." Her words were quiet but unwavering. Liam listened, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I didn't choose this life," she said, "but I choose to stay, because someone has to." Something shifted in Liam's expression, the cocky veneer thinning. He rubbed a hand over his jaw and spoke without looking at her. "I was 12 when my mother died. My father," he was devastated, but instead of falling apart, he buried himself in work. And then he expected me to be perfect, to be him. Nothing I did was ever enough. Every mistake felt like a scar on the company name. And I hate it. I hate the pressure, the expectations, the way every room I walk into is already decided before I speak. Sophie watched him carefully. In that moment, the arrogant air vanished, replaced by a boy who had never quite healed. "It's lonely," he added quietly, "being the son of Charles Harrington. Everyone assumes I have everything, but they don't see how little control I actually have." A silence settled over the table, not heavy but fragile. Sophie reached across and brushed her fingertips lightly against the back of his hand. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for both of us." Liam startled at the touch, glancing up at her. "Yeah," he whispered. "Me too." The moment hung between them, delicate, unspoken. Then Liam pulled his hand back and straightened his posture, as if catching himself in a lapse of weakness. His trademark smirk returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "But none of that changes tonight," he said, forcing levity into his tone. "We still have a deal. You'll be my date. We'll go to the party, and I'll collect my winnings. My father will hate it, which is just an added bonus." Sophie held his gaze, sadness flickering behind her calm expression. "If that's what you want," she said softly. "It is," Liam replied, but even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. As the rain outside turned into a steady downpour, they sat in silence. Two people from different worlds, bound together by circumstance and pride, unaware that tonight would change them both, and nothing about the game would go according to plan. The Harrington Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold that night. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light over tables dressed in white linen, and the air smelled faintly of roses and aged whiskey. Chicago's most powerful had gathered here. CEOs, senators, venture capitalists, even a few old money families whose names carried weight far beyond the Midwest. All had come to celebrate the 60th birthday of Charles Harrington, the man who had built an industrial empire from a single factory floor. Sophie Miller stood just inside the entrance, her hands trembling as she clutched the small clutch bag she'd borrowed from a friend. In her crimson dress, she looked nothing like the woman who scrubbed floors for a living, but she felt like an imposter all the same. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she scanned the glittering room. This was a world she had only ever glimpsed from a distance, a world of money, privilege, and power that had always existed on the other side of the glass. "Relax," Liam murmured beside her, slipping a hand to the small of her back as they stepped forward. "You look fine. Better than fine, actually." She glanced up at him, searching for a trace of mockery, but his gaze was steady. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said with a wry smile. "But here we are." As they crossed the room, Sophie braced herself for ridicule, for whispers, smirks, or sideways glances, but none came. Instead, a silver-haired man with a distinguished air stepped forward to shake Liam's hand. "Liam, my boy," he said warmly, "you've grown up since I last saw you. And your companion, what grace! What poise!" He turned to Sophie and bowed slightly. "It's a pleasure, miss." Thank you," she stammered, caught off guard. Another man approached, stroking his neatly trimmed beard as he studied her. "What a rare elegance you possess, my dear," he said before taking her hand and pressing it lightly to his lips. "Your presence is a delight." The compliments continued as they moved deeper into the room. People who had once dismissed Liam as a spoiled heir now regarded him with newfound respect because of her. Sophie answered polite questions with quiet intelligence, discussing art, literature, and history with a calm confidence that surprised even herself. Slowly, the knot in her stomach loosened. Across the room, Charles Harrington watched all of this unfold, his expression unreadable. At first, suspicion flickered in his eyes. He had heard about his son's foolish bet and expected the worst. But as he saw Sophie converse effortlessly with his oldest partners, his gaze softened. Finally, he approached his son and spoke quietly enough for only Liam to hear. "Your companion is remarkable," Charles said, glancing toward Sophie. "It seems I may have misjudged your taste." For Liam, the words struck deeper than any praise he'd ever received. They were simple, almost casual, but from his father they meant everything. For the first time in years, Charles wasn't disappointed in him. Pride, real, genuine pride, lit his father's eyes. Liam felt something shift inside him, something far more satisfying than any bet could ever bring. But the fragile peace shattered minutes later. As the formal speeches ended and guests began to mingle freely, a familiar laugh sliced through the hum of conversation. Liam's friends had arrived, the same ones who had placed the bet and now watched him with predatory amusement from near the bar. "Liam!" one of them called, clapping him on the back as he and the others approached. "Time for the show, my friend. We've been waiting all night." Another leaned in close, his breath heavy with liquor. "Come on, man. We paid good money for this. Let's see your Cinderella dance." Before Sophie could react, one of them draped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Tell us, sweetheart," he slurred, "do you sweep the boardroom the same way you sweep the floors?" Sophie flinched and tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Panic and fury surged inside her. "Let go of me," she hissed. In an instant, Liam was there. "Hands off," he snapped, shoving his friend back with more force than necessary. "Don't touch her." The man stumbled, laughing. "Whoa, easy. What's your problem? She's part of the game, your game." "She's under my protection," Liam said, his voice like steel. "Get out, all of you." The four men stared at him, their drunken smiles faltering. "You've lost your damn mind," one muttered. Across the room, heads were turning. Conversations faltered. And then Charles's voice boomed above the noise. "What is going on here?" Silence fell. His gaze swept over the scene. Sophie pale and shaking, Liam standing defensively in front of her, and the group of drunken young men retreating like chastised schoolboys. Fury darkened the CEO's face. "This is my celebration," Charles thundered, "not a playground for your juvenile antics." The humiliation was too much. Sophie's breath came in short, sharp bursts as the stares around her multiplied. Whispered speculation rippled through the crowd. Before anyone could stop her, she turned and fled, her heels clicking across the marble floor as she pushed through the ballroom doors and into the night. She didn't see Liam lunge after her, stopped only by his father's furious hand on his arm. She didn't see the argument erupt between father and son, or the betrayal etched across Liam's face as his so-called friend slunk away. All she knew was that the night air was cold against her tear-streaked cheeks, and that no matter what Liam had done, no matter how fiercely he had stood up for her, her dignity felt shattered before them all. The morning after the disastrous party dawned gray and heavy, as though even the sky shared Sophie Miller's dread. She stood in the elevator of Harrington Manufacturing's headquarters, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked composed, hair neat, dress modest, but inside her stomach churned. She had spent most of the night replaying every humiliating second of the banquet. The way the guests stared, the laughter she thought she heard as she fled, the sting of shame that refused to fade. By the time the elevator chimed on the executive floor, Sophie had already braced herself for what was coming. She imagined security waiting by the door, a termination letter ready for her to sign, maybe even a polite escort out of the building. She had accepted it. It was better than walking through these halls with whispers following her everywhere. But when she was ushered into Charles Harrington's office, the scene that greeted her was nothing like she expected. The CEO of Harrington Manufacturing sat behind his massive oak desk, his posture imposing, but his expression strangely soft. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sophie hesitated before lowering herself into it. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize for what happened last night. I never meant to cause a scene. If you want me gone, I understand." Charles lifted a hand, silencing her. "There was a scandal last night," he said slowly, "a disgraceful display of arrogance and immaturity. But not from you." Sophie blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "You have nothing to apologize for," Charles continued, his tone firm now. "In fact, I owe you thanks. Last night, for the first time, I saw my son as something more than the reckless boy who spent his life disappointing me. I saw him defend someone. I saw him choose dignity over foolishness." The door opened behind her before Sophie could respond. Liam stepped into the room, his usual confident stride replaced with something quieter, humbler. His eyes found hers immediately, and in them she saw no trace of the arrogant man who had mocked her days before. "Sophie," he said softly, taking a seat beside her, "I owe you an apology. For everything. The bet, the humiliation, the way I treated you. I was a coward hiding behind people who didn't care about me." She stared at him, unsure what to say. "I told them this morning that I'm done," Liam continued, his voice steadying. "Those so-called friends, they're out of my life. And out of this company. I don't want anything to do with them again." Charles nodded approvingly. "I've already begun the process of cutting ties with them professionally. People like that corrupt everything they touch. I will not have them anywhere near this business." The words settled over the room, heavy and real. Sophie felt something shift inside her, a cautious, reluctant hope. Charles leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "There's something else," he said. "You have qualities this company desperately needs. Intelligence, resilience, integrity. I believe you can help my son become the leader he's meant to be. And he, in turn, can teach you skills that will take you far beyond cleaning floors." Sophie's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm offering you a position," Charles said with a faint smile. "Personal assistant to Liam. Work closely with him. Keep him grounded, and learn everything you can about management and business. I believe the two of you can make each other better." The room fell silent. Sophie stared at her hands, the weight of the offer pressing down on her. This was more than a job, it was a chance to rewrite everything. But the memory of the humiliation still burned, and she knew she couldn't accept without one condition. "I'll do it," she said finally, lifting her gaze to meet Charles's. "But only if Liam promises to leave his childish bets behind. Forever." Liam didn't hesitate. He smiled, not the smirk she had grown used to, but something genuine, warm, and disarmingly sincere. "I swear it," he said. "No more bets. No more games. From now on, I'm all in. On the company, on doing better, on earning your trust." Something unspoken passed between them then, an understanding, fragile but real. Sophie nodded slowly. "Then yes, I'll do it." Charles allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Good," he said. I have a feeling this is the start of something extraordinary. When Sophie left the office that morning, the air felt lighter, the sky brighter. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like she was walking toward something instead of running away. And as for Liam, he watched her go with the quiet certainty that his life, too, had just changed course forever. 3 years later, the headquarters of Harrington Manufacturing looked different, brighter, more open, humming with an energy it hadn't known before. The same glass tower that had once felt cold and distant now buzzed with collaboration and innovation. New departments had been born, old systems had been rebuilt, and the company had transformed from a rigid industrial giant into a forward-thinking powerhouse that set standards for the entire Midwest. And at the heart of that transformation were two people whose story had begun as a cruel joke. Sophie Miller walked through the hallways now with quiet confidence, greeting employees by name, pausing to listen when someone stopped her with a question or an idea. It had become a common sight. Department heads seeking her input before pitching a new initiative, interns asking for advice on navigating their careers. To many at Harrington, Sophie wasn't just the CEO's right hand. She was the company's compass. Her empathy, her intelligence, and her unwavering belief in people had created a culture that thrived on trust rather than fear. "Morning, Sophie," called a young project manager as she passed. "Got a minute later to review the prototype deck?" "Of course," she replied with a smile. "Send it over. I'll look at it before lunch." There had been a time when Sophie doubted she belonged here at all, when she had walked these same halls with her head down, invisible and insignificant. Now, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. And yet, what made the transformation most remarkable wasn't just her growth, it was Liam's. In the boardroom upstairs, Liam Harrington stood before a group of executives outlining a bold new expansion plan. The young man who once scoffed at responsibility had disappeared. In his place was a leader, visionary, driven, but grounded. He spoke not of profits and power, but of sustainability, innovation, and legacy. "This isn't just about growth," Liam said, his tone firm but passionate. "It's about building something that lasts. A company that respects its workers, uplifts its communities, and adapts to the future. That's the Harrington we're building now." The room erupted in applause. Charles Harrington, seated at the head of the table, said nothing for a long moment, but the faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth spoke volumes. Pride radiated in his eyes, not the pride of a man pleased with a quarterly report, but of a father who had watched his son become everything he'd once doubted he could be. Later that evening, the three of them shared dinner in Charles's townhouse overlooking Lake Michigan. It had become a tradition, a monthly meal, no business talk, just family. Over bowls of Charles's favorite clam chowder, they laughed about boardroom blunders, childhood stories, and the small absurdities of corporate life. At one point, Charles raised his glass toward Liam. "You know," he said with mock solemnity, "I wasn't sure you'd ever get here. There were years I thought you'd burn this company to the ground just to spite me." Liam chuckled, glancing at Sophie beside him. "Honestly, so did I." He turned back to his father, his smile softening. "But I had help." Charles followed his son's gaze and nodded, a rare warmth filling his voice. "Yes, and I'm grateful for that help every day." When the plates were cleared and the conversation turned quiet, Liam leaned back in his chair, looking at Sophie with a grin that still carried a trace of the boyish charm she had first met. "You know," he said, "I think about it sometimes, the bet. $20,000. It seemed like such a big deal back then." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And now?" "Now." Liam laughed, shaking his head. "It's nothing. Absolutely nothing compared to what I actually won." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Because that ridiculous, humiliating bet led me to the most valuable thing in my life." Sophie felt her cheeks warm as Charles pretended to clear his throat loudly. All right, that's enough sentimentality for one night, he teased, but his eyes betrayed his happiness. As the evening faded into a soft Chicago night, Sophie and Liam walked home together beneath the glow of the city lights. Their lives were unrecognizable from what they had been 3 years earlier. They were partners, in business, in love, in purpose. The company they guided together was thriving, not just because of profit margins or market share, but because it had a soul now. Because they had built something on respect, trust, and shared vision. Standing on the balcony of their apartment, the lake shimmering dark and endless beyond the city skyline, Sophie leaned against the railing and exhaled. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" she asked softly. "All the time," Liam said, sliding an arm around her shoulders. "It started as a joke. A stupid, ugly joke. But it became everything." Sophie smiled, resting her head against his chest. "It's funny how life works." "Not funny," Liam murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Beautiful." Below them, Chicago pulsed with life. Cars on the streets, boats moving silently across the water. The city always changing, yet somehow eternal. Much like the company they now led. Much like the life they were building together. And so a story that had begun with cruelty and humiliation ended in something extraordinary. Not just love, but transformation. A son who had once mocked responsibility had become a leader. A woman once invisible had become the soul of a legacy. And a cruel bet that was meant to demean had instead built a future neither of them could have imagined.